February 28, 2026, will forever be etched in history as the moment the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East was shattered beyond recognition. As the first light of dawn touched the minarets of Tehran, the world was oblivious to the fact that the most sophisticated decapitation strike in modern warfare was already in its terminal phase. For decades, the Islamic Republic had built its defense on the premise of being an impenetrable fortress, a mosaic defense designed to survive the loss of any single limb. But on this Saturday morning, in the middle of the holy month of Ramadan, the United States and Israel didn't just aim for a limb. They struck at the very heart and brain of the regime simultaneously. The operation, codenamed Epic Fury by the Pentagon and Roaring Lion by the Israeli Defense Forces, was a masterclass in deception and lethal precision. For weeks, the Trump administration and Israeli officials had broadcast signals of ongoing diplomacy, with Omani mediators claiming peace was within reach. Behind this smokescreen, however, intelligence assets from the CIA and Mossad had achieved the impossible: total penetration of the supreme leader's inner sanctum. Through the pattern of life analysis, a meticulous tracking of movement via hacked Tehran traffic cameras and mobile network metadata, they knew exactly when the most guarded individuals in Iran would be gathered in one place. At precisely 9:50 a.m. local time, the silence over Tehran was obliterated by the scream of munitions. 200 Israeli fighter jets, in the largest sortie in the history of their air force, synchronized with American B-2 stealth bombers and Tomahawk missiles launched from the Persian Gulf. The target was a compound on Pasteur Street, where Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was meeting with over 40 of his top commanders, including the defense minister and the head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. It was a target of opportunity that neither Washington nor Tel Aviv could ignore. The strikes were so precise that they targeted specific rooms within the compound. Within minutes, the head of the Islamic Republic was severed. Confirmed reports soon emerged that the body of the 86-year-old Supreme Leader had been recovered from the smoldering rubble. This wasn't just a military victory. It was a psychological detonation. The man who had ruled with an iron fist for 36 years, the superglue of the Iranian system, was gone. President Donald Trump, monitoring the operation from Mar-a-Lago, took to Truth Social to confirm the news, calling it justice for the victims of the regime's bloodthirsty thugs. But as the smoke cleared over the leveled compound, a new and more terrifying reality began to take shape. The decapitation strike had worked, but it had also released a cornered beast. Across the Middle East, the true promise of Iranian retaliation was about to be fulfilled. This was no longer a shadow war. It was an all-out regional conflagration where the rules of engagement had vanished, along with the leadership in Tehran. As news of Ayatollah Khamenei's death rippled through the global consciousness, the skies over Tehran, already choked with the dust of leveled command centers, became the arena for the most lopsided yet terrifying aerial engagement of the 21st century. The Islamic Republic of Iran Air Force, long considered a collection of flying museums, launched a desperate final sortie to reclaim some semblance of national honor. 5 Iranian fighter jets, a mix of Aging 14, Tomcats, and MiG-29 Fulcrums, scrambled from Mehrabad Air Base in a suicide mission to intercept the invisible ghosts dominating their airspace. The result was a clinical display of technological slaughter. Within less than 5 minutes, all 5 Iranian jets were erased from the sky by beyond visual range missiles fired from American F-22 Raptors and Israeli F-35 Adirs. The Iranian pilots never even saw a blip on their radar screens before their aircraft disintegrated into falling debris, raining down over the Tehran suburbs like burning stars signaling the end of an era. However, the silence of the Iranian Air Force did not signal a white flag. Instead, the most harrowing scenario feared by geopolitical analysts began to materialize. With the supreme leadership decapitated, the fail-safe protocols of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, were triggered. Control over the nation's strategic arsenal shifted from a centralized command to mid-level commanders in the field, men fueled not by statecraft, but by pure ideological rage and a Samson option mentality. Iran's dead hand system was activated. From deep within the reinforced missile cities carved into the Zagros Mountains, dozens of Shahab-3 and Sejil ballistic missiles roared into the atmosphere, their guidance systems locked onto coordinates in Tel Aviv, Haifa, and American logistical hubs in Riyadh and Kuwait. This was no longer a calibrated tit-for-tat exchange like those seen in previous years. This was an unmasked, scorched earth retaliation. In Tel Aviv, the Iron Dome and Arrow defense systems worked at a frantic, unprecedented pace, painting the night sky with the blinding flashes of successful interceptions. But the sheer volume of the incoming salvos threatened to saturate the grid. One missile managed to punch through the defensive umbrella, impacting near the port of Haifa and sending a massive shockwave through the city's industrial heart. Meanwhile, in Saudi Arabia, the American missions in Riyadh were forced into a total lockdown as missile debris fell onto the diplomatic quarter. The Pentagon issued an immediate red alert, urging all United States citizens to evacuate the Middle East. But the directive felt hollow as the entire Persian Gulf became a restricted fire zone, trapping thousands in the crossfire of a collapsing regional order. The world watched in horror as it became clear that killing the head of the Iranian dragon had not killed the beast. Instead, Washington had created a power vacuum filled by the most radical elements of the regime who now held their fingers on the nuclear and chemical triggers. The chaos was spreading like a wildfire, drawing in Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthi rebels in Yemen, who launched their own synchronized strikes against Red Sea shipping in Israeli border towns. As President Trump's advisors gathered in the Situation Room, the grim reality set in. Toppling a regime was the easy part, but managing the violent physics of its disintegration was a challenge for which there was no established playbook. As Iranian ballistic missiles illuminated the Gulf skies, the world realized with chilling clarity that this was no longer a limited regional skirmish, it was total war. In Washington, the corridors of the Pentagon were thick with an unprecedented sense of urgency. United States military satellites had detected ominous movements at Iran's most sensitive nuclear sites, from the fortified halls of Natanz to the mountain-shrouded depths of Fordo. Unconfirmed intelligence reports suggested that in the chaotic vacuum following Ayatollah Khamenei's death, a cadre of the most loyal IRGC generals had accessed the activation codes for experimental warheads. The nightmare of a nuclear-armed Iran, which had haunted Western planners for decades, suddenly transitioned from a theoretical risk to an imminent catastrophe. President Trump's response was characteristically decisive. If the threat could not be contained, Tehran's retaliatory nuclear capacity had to be utterly annihilated before the first countdown could finish. Meanwhile, on the ground in Iran, the vision of a democratic liberation promised by Washington was rapidly decomposing into a humanitarian horror story. The campaign of saturation strikes against military targets often nestled within dense urban fabrics was exacting a staggering toll on the civilian population. Iranian state media, though crippled, managed to broadcast harrowing footage of a girls' school in the southern city of Minab, reduced to smoldering ruins, claiming dozens of children had perished. President Trump, in a dramatic televised address from the Oval Office, appealed directly to the Iranian people to seize the moment and topple the remnants of the regime. He declared that the hour of their freedom was at hand, but he coupled this hope with a cold, clinical warning: stay sheltered. Don't leave your home. It's very dangerous outside. Bombs will be dropping everywhere. It was a message of bitter contradictions, a promise of liberty delivered through the roar of B-2 bombers dropping tons of high explosives. The collapse of the chain of command in Tehran triggered unpredictable and lethal scenarios. In the Strait of Hormuz, IRGC naval swarms began a process of indiscriminate mining, threatening to sever the global economy's primary artery. Crude oil prices on international markets skyrocketed to $250 a barrel within mere hours, triggering a frantic sell-off on stock exchanges from New York to Tokyo. American allies in Europe began to voice panicked concerns regarding a new wave of refugees and the specter of transnational asymmetric terror attacks. Yet, in Tel Aviv, the atmosphere was a volatile mix of relief and hypervigilance. Israeli officials understood that while taking down Khamenei was a historic victory, the price might be a multi-year conflict where the line between triumph and collective suicide had become razor-thin. As night fell on the fourth day of the war, Tehran was no longer a city of light and life. It was a city of ghosts, where the air raid sirens never ceased and the acrid stench of cordite hung heavy in the air. All efforts to resume civilian flights had failed, as Iranian airspace was declared an absolute no-fly zone. The United States had successfully decapitated the serpent, but its body was still thrashing with world-ending strength. The ultimate question was no longer whether the regime would fall, but whether the world could survive the fallout when thousands of missiles remained in the hands of men who felt they had nothing left to lose. As the conflict entered its second week, the optimistic projections of a V-shaped war, a quick strike followed by a rapid transition to a pro-Western government, evaporated into the reality of a grinding, multi-front attrition. The strategic miscalculation mirrored the early days of the Iraq and Afghanistan campaigns, but on a scale that was exponentially more dangerous. Washington had assumed that by removing the Ayatollah, the Iranian people would rise in a unified, pro-democratic wave. Instead, the country fractured into a chaotic mosaic of competing militias, local warlords, and radicalized IRGC units who viewed the American presence as an existential crusade. The liberation of Tehran was beginning to look less like a new beginning and more like a massive, continental-scale version of the Syrian civil war, but with the added horror of a highly industrialized military infrastructure. The economic shockwaves were now paralyzing global trade. With the Strait of Hormuz effectively a dead zone due to smart mines and shore-to-ship missiles, the energy markets spiraled into a delirium that saw gas prices in the United States hit $12 a gallon. In Europe, the situation was even more dire. The sudden loss of Middle Eastern energy supplies, coupled with the threat of Iranian-linked cyber attacks on power grids in Berlin and Paris, pushed the NATO alliance to a breaking point. Protests erupted in major Western capitals, not just against the war, but against the sheer economic impossibility of daily life. The Trump administration, initially riding a wave of high approval ratings following the successful strike on Khamenei, now faced a domestic public that was growing weary of the forever war rhetoric being reborn in the desert sands of Persia. On the tactical front, the United States military was forced to shift from strategic decapitation to emergency containment. American aircraft carriers in the Arabian Sea were under constant threat from swarm tactics, hundreds of small, unmanned explosive boats, and low-flying kamikaze drones designed to overwhelm Aegis defense systems. While no carrier had been sunk, the USS Abraham Lincoln was forced to withdraw to a safer distance after a saturation attack damaged its flight deck, a symbolic blow to American naval prestige. The Pentagon began to realize that while they owned the sky, they did not own the silence. Every Iranian missile site destroyed seemed to be replaced by 2 mobile launchers hidden in civilian garages or ancient underground QAnons. The most disturbing development, however, was the Ghost Protocol. Intelligence intercepts suggested that several high-ranking Iranian scientists, along with portable containers of highly enriched uranium, had disappeared from the Natanz facility hours before the first American bombs fell. The fear was no longer just about a state-launched nuclear strike, but about dirty bombs being smuggled across the porous borders into Iraq, Turkey, or even toward the Mediterranean. The war had moved beyond the battlefield. It was now a global hunt for shadows. As the sun set over the ruins of the Azadi Tower, the world held its breath, wondering if the masterstroke that killed the Ayatollah had inadvertently opened a Pandora's box that no amount of military might could ever close. As the conflict bled into its third week, the tactical brilliance of the initial decapitation strike began to be overshadowed by a strategic quagmire of epic proportions. Washington had effectively shattered the Iranian state, but in doing so, it had inadvertently unified the most radicalized factions of the Islamic world against a common invader. The Vietnamization of the Iranian plateau was no longer a theoretical warning. It was a daily reality. American ground forces, initially deployed to secure key oil terminals and nuclear sites, found themselves trapped in a labyrinth of urban insurgencies. In cities like Isfahan and Tabriz, the resistance was not coming from a structured army, but from decentralized neighborhood committees, armed with advanced anti-tank missiles and a relentless supply of improvised explosives. The human cost of the war was reaching a tipping point that the global conscience could no longer ignore. Despite the Pentagon's insistence on surgical precision, the sheer scale of the bombardment had left Iran's infrastructure in ruins. Power grids were dark, water treatment plants had failed, and a massive cholera outbreak was reported in the overcrowded refugee camps forming along the Turkish and Iraqi borders. The images of suffering children pulling belongings from the rubble of Tehran began to dominate social media, bypassing state-controlled narratives, and sparking a massive anti-war movement within the United States. President Trump, facing a mounting backlash from both the international community and a weary domestic electorate, doubled down on his maximum pressure rhetoric, insisting that the chaos was a necessary precursor to a great Iranian rebirth. Behind the scenes, the geopolitical fallout was even more seismic. Russia and China, seeing an opportunity to permanently weaken American influence, began a series of high-stakes maneuvers. Moscow moved advanced S-400 missile systems into southern Armenia, effectively creating a no-go zone for American aircraft near the Iranian border. Meanwhile, Beijing signed a series of emergency energy security pacts with several Gulf nations, positioning itself as the only stable mediator left in a region on fire. The American dollar, the bedrock of global trade, began to show signs of unprecedented volatility as nations looked for alternatives to avoid the crippling impact of the energy-induced global recession. The most terrifying development, however, remained the whereabouts of the missing elements of the IRGC. Intelligence analysts in Langley were now convinced that a shadow government had been established in the vast underground tunnel networks of eastern Iran. This shadow leadership was not interested in governing. They were interested in exportable chaos. Reports began to surface of dirty bomb components being moved through the subterranean tunnels of the Silk Road. The war was no longer about borders or regimes. It had evolved into a desperate race against time to prevent the first act of nuclear terrorism in human history. The historic dogfight that had downed 5 Iranian jets weeks ago now felt like a relic from a simpler time, as the world stared into an abyss that seemed to have no bottom. As the conflict entered its 4th week, the crisis transcended military calculations to become an existential threat to the global order. In Tehran, what once stood as symbols of absolute power were reduced to fractured concrete, where armed factions now fought for every street in a brutal, disorganized civil war. Despite holding total technological dominance, the United States faced a grim reality. You can defeat an army, but you cannot easily suppress an ideology pushed to the brink of extinction. Recent battlefield reports indicated that American special operations units were being forced to withdraw from urban centers to protect vital supply lines, as waves of low-cost kamikaze drone attacks and suicide strikes steadily eroded the morale and manpower of the expeditionary forces. On the international stage, Washington's isolation grew to alarming levels. The United Nations Security Council remained in a state of total paralysis as rival superpowers utilized their veto power as a primary political weapon. The global economy, already fragile from previous pandemics and supply chain crises, entered a state of freefall. The severe energy shortage halted production lines from East Asia to Western Europe, plunging millions into unemployment. Public outrage was no longer directed solely at Tehran or Washington. It had transformed into a global wave of resistance against the instability unleashed by epic fury. Within the United States, massive anti-war protests reached the very gates of the White House, creating immense political pressure on the Trump administration ahead of critical elections. However, in the shadows of this destruction, the seeds of an uncertain future began to take root. Exile opposition groups backed by the West attempted to form a provisional government at a secret location near the border, but internal divisions and a lack of domestic legitimacy rendered these efforts largely futile. Meanwhile, local leaders within Iran began establishing autonomous zones, creating a new political map riddled with volatility. The world realized that the death of Ayatollah Khamenei was not the end of a regime, but the beginning of a leaderless era of chaos. The American iron fist had shattered the old vessel, but its shards were now causing the entire world to bleed. As the final sorties of the massive bombing campaign paused to make room for desperate, last-minute diplomatic maneuvers, the sky over Tehran remained a deep, bruised crimson from fire and smoke. The historic dogfight that downed 5 Iranian jets in the opening minutes was now just a minor footnote in a history book written in blood and tears. The lesson of epic fury remains a bitter truth. In modern geopolitics, absolute military victory can sometimes be the catalyst for a total strategic defeat. The Iranian dragon has lost its head, but its fire will likely scorch the region for decades to come. The world changed forever on that February morning, and the price of freedom imposed by missiles may be a debt that humanity pays with the stability of an entire century.